Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely fascinating 200-year chunk of English history. We're looking at the years 1600 to 1800, which was a time of massive, ground-shaking societal shifts that completely transformed the written word. Honestly, if you want to understand how we got from epic poems about heaven and hell all the way to the modern novels you read today, you have to understand the history that forced those changes.
We can basically view this whole period as a giant cultural pendulum swinging through four distinct eras: the Age of Revolution, the Age of Reason, the rise of the novel, and finally, the transition to Romanticism. So let's jump right into the chaos, shall we?
Section 1. The Age of Revolution. Let's step back into the 1600s, an era completely defined by political conflict, religious tension, and literal bloody revolution.
The 17th century was, well, it was relentlessly turbulent. You had Parliament fighting the king, which erupted into the English Civil War in 1642. Then, in 1649, came the shocking execution of King Charles I, by his own people. After that came a period of strict Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, and eventually the monarchy was restored in 1660. But the tension didn't stop there. By 1688, the Glorious Revolution permanently established that Parliament, not the king, held the ultimate power, birthing a constitutional democracy. Talk about a century of extreme highs and lows.
So out of all this deep chaos and religious intensity emerged a really fascinating group known as the metaphysical poets. And they weren't writing simple, flowery verses. Instead, they relied heavily on something called the metaphysical conceit. Basically, this is an extended, highly unusual comparison between two completely different things. They used intense intellect, science, and complex arguments to explore profound themes, love, religion, the human soul. They were essentially trying to make sense of a world that felt fundamentally unstable.
To see just how wild this gets, let's look at John Donne. When leaving on a trip, he didn't write a standard "I'll miss you" love poem to his wife. Nope. Instead, he compared their two souls to a stiff twin drafting compass. Yeah, the tool you use in geometry. He argued that even though he's the foot that has to roam around, she is the fixed foot in the center. And because she's steady, he'll always circle perfectly back to her. It's wild. He literally merged romance with mathematics and philosophy to make this incredibly deep emotional point.
Now, this era of political upheaval also gave us John Milton. Milton actually supported the rebellion during the Civil War, and in his absolute masterpiece, Paradise Lost, he reflected the political rebellion of his time through the ultimate story of defiance, Satan rebelling against God. He gives us that iconic ultimate declaration of defiance: better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It just perfectly captured that intense desire for individual freedom and power, which mirrored the very real war was being fought right there in the English streets.
But society can only handle so much chaos before it breaks. As the 17th century ended, people grew exhausted by the constant religious and political wars. So that cultural pendulum, which had been pushed to the absolute extreme of emotion, complex philosophy, and religious intensity, well, it began to swing away. People suddenly wanted the exact opposite. They craved order, structure, and pure logic.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Age of Reason. Entering the 1700s, this massive craving for order birthed the Enlightenment.
And how did this new focus on reason reach the general public? Well, it all comes down to a single penny. For just 1 cent, everyday citizens could enter a London coffeehouse. You can think of these penny universities as the 18th century equivalent of an internet forum or a social media feed. Literally anyone could walk in, buy a coffee, and instantly be surrounded by people reading newspapers, debating politics, and discussing philosophy. Print culture absolutely boomed. Literature was no longer just for the aristocratic elite locked in their castles, it was for the everyday urban public.
Writers of this era fully embraced a style called neoclassicism. They looked way back to the ancient Romans for inspiration on how to create perfectly ordered art. Alexander Pope was the absolute master of this. Take his famous line, "To err is human, to forgive divine." It's written in what's known as a heroic couplet. It's perfectly balanced, incredibly logical, and super easy to remember. Literature wasn't trying to untangle the complex human soul with bizarre metaphors anymore. Instead, it was trying to teach clear moral lessons using perfectly structured language.
However, there's a catch. When an entire society prides itself on being perfectly logical and impeccably polite, well, it creates the perfect breeding ground for hypocrisy. And that made the 18th century the golden age of satire. Satire is basically using humor, irony, and exaggeration to expose human weakness and criticize society. Writers figured out that the best way to correct society's bad behavior wasn't to just preach at them, it was to ruthlessly mock people into changing, using sharp, highly intellectual humor.
Take Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Today, a lot of us just think of it as a fun children's story, right? But actually, Swift used it to systematically dismantle his society. In the first part, Lilliput, he mocked the extreme pettiness of British politics. In Brobdingnag, he exposed human physical ugliness and our ridiculous pride. In Laputa, he made fun of Enlightenment scientists who were all intellect but had zero common sense. And finally, with the Houyennhnms, he questioned whether human beings were actually rational creatures at all. It was just brilliant, biting criticism entirely disguised as a fun adventure.
Section 3. The Rise of the Novel. While poets and satirists were busy imitating the ancient Romans, a massive economic shift was quietly creating an entirely new form of literature. You see, the 18th century saw the rapid rise of the middle class. We're talking merchants, traders, and shop owners who were suddenly gaining wealth and unprecedented social power. As they prospered, literacy rates began climbing dramatically, and cheaper printing presses made books way more accessible. But here's the absolute key to all of this. This newly empowered middle class, they didn't want to read epic poems about ancient kings or Greek gods anymore. They wanted stories about individuals. They demanded highly realistic stories about people just like them, navigating everyday issues like money, marriage, and morality. And just like that, the English novel was born. Because the focus had shifted completely to the individual, writers needed a new structure to explore a normal person's life. This gave rise to a term you might have heard, the Bildungsroman. It's essentially a novel dedicated entirely to tracking the growth, education, and moral journey of a single relatable character from youth all the way to adulthood. It's basically the exact blueprint for every modern coming-of-age movie you've ever seen. For the first time, readers could watch the entire moral struggle of a normal human life play out realistically on the page.
And it's crazy to look at how rapidly this brand new genre evolved in just a few decades. Daniel Defoe gave us Robinson Crusoe, completely mastering the realistic adventure of a middle-class man surviving by his own hard work. Then Samuel Richardson wrote Pamela, entirely through letters, diving deep into psychological realism. Henry Fielding took a step back and gave us the all-knowing narrator in Tom Jones to judge society. And finally, Lawrence Stern wrote Tristram Shandy, completely breaking every single rule of narrative structure. In just one century, these writers laid the entire foundation for modern storytelling.
Section 4. Transition to Romanticism. But, as we've learned, the pendulum of history never, ever stays still. The real catalyst for this next big swing was the Industrial Revolution. Almost overnight, the landscape was filled with factories, huge machines, and thick pollution. The strict logic and reason that built the Enlightenment, well, it now seemed to be building a cold, mechanical, and deeply unequal urban world. In reaction to this, writers began to completely reject that neoclassical obsession with order and polite society. Instead, they swung hard back towards the individual, romanticizing raw emotion, nature, and personal freedom.
You can see this transition perfectly in the work of Thomas Gray. In his famous poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, he absolutely shocked the literary world. Why? Because he chose not to write about rich aristocrats or great politicians. Instead, he stood in a rural graveyard and wrote about the poor, completely forgotten villagers buried there. His quote, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave," proves that all human life, no matter how poor or common, holds profound emotional weight and true dignity.
As this transition into Romanticism really accelerated, writers like William Blake and Robert Barnes completely abandoned those polite, upper-class rules of literature. Blake used his poetry to highlight the brutal, heartbreaking suffering of child chimney sweepers in London. He was actively championing the common worker and elevating the pure innocence of childhood way above the cold, unfeeling machinery of the industrial world. Suddenly, imagination and human sympathy were vastly more valuable than cold, hard logic.
So as we watch this incredible pendulum swing, from the chaotic religion of the Age of Revolution to the strict, polite order of the Age of Reason, through the realistic birth of the novel, and finally crashing right into the rebellion of romantic emotion, it leaves us with a genuinely fascinating question to ponder. If logic, science, and structure built our modern world, why is it that we still so deeply crave stories driven by raw emotion, individual freedom, and nature? It's something to think about the next time you pick up a book. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.